Welcome to another episode of The Unseen Paranormal, where some of the scariest things are unseen. I'm your host, Eric Freeman. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Today we are chatting with Bigfoot researcher and author Dr. Russell Jones. His books include Tracking the Stone Man, West Virginia's Bigfoot, and his newest book, The Appalachian Bigfoot. Dr. Jones is a researcher with Bigfoot Field Research Organization, or BFRO, and has been featured on the television show Finding Bigfoot. You can find his books on Amazon, Kindle, and wherever fine books are sold. Hey, Dr. Jones, welcome to the show.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me, man.
Not a problem. I haven't talked about Bigfoot in a while, so I was looking for somebody else, and your book just came out with Beyond the Fray, who I work a lot with, and wanted to have you on to talk about some Bigfoot, especially in my part of the country, because your newest book is about Appalachian Bigfoot. It just does that. We were kind of talking a little bit before recording here that it just doesn't kind of get the attention that like the Pacific Northwest does or other areas of the country.
You know, the Pacific Northwest, as I always call it, is the original children, because that's where all the original reports were from and all the historical big stories that are out there. And the East Coast were all the stepchildren, because for years and years and years, no one believed that it was possible that, you know, if Bigfoot existed, he probably didn't exist on the East Coast.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because Peter Burns, which is one of the four horsemen, like the people that are most renowned in Bigfoot research, he just did a new book, and I just read a new edition. I was shocked that he still didn't believe that Bigfoot was on the East Coast. And he also was skeptical of people that had more than one sighting, which used to be a big deal, say 20 or 30 years ago. But now we know that it's fairly common for people to have more than one sighting.
Yeah, growing up in Tennessee and being around that part of the Appalachian Mountains, I mean, I've seen reports in newspapers back to the 1800s of the Tennessee Wild Man as kind of a local legend around Tennessee, and Bigfoot reports. Back in the 1800s, the newspaper article, one of them that I saw, was warning women and children to be careful and not be out at night because the wild man will snatch you up.
Yeah, you know, and we have a historical, there's a lot of different Indian tribes through Appalachia, but 5 of the tribes had names for Bigfoot. So historically, it goes back to the newspaper in the 1800s, but a long time before that. And then even some of the pioneers like Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, had said that they had, seen or shot a Bigfoot. So it's part of the lore, in our area.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're up in West Virginia, Ohio area, the Appalachian.
Yeah, I grew up Southeast Ohio, and when I came out of doctor school, I moved straight to Charleston. And part of the reason why I moved here is because of being able to, you're 10 minutes from the state capitol, but you're able to own a couple hundred acres. 10 minutes from the capitol, it's world-class outdoors. Anytime I want to go to the woods, I can be someplace very quickly. And I have a farm in Athens, Ohio, which is about an hour or so just from where I live in West Virginia, and I spend an awful lot of time there as well.
Yeah, and just so the listeners know, you're a doctor in chiropractic medicine.
Yeah, I had an undergraduate degree in science, and I have my doctor degree in chiropractic, and then I'm also a certified master naturalist. So master naturalists are people that should be able to identify any plant, any tree, any fungus, any mold, any fern, anything that's found in Appalachia. By and large, you can usually identify it. A lot of the states offer classes, but West Virginia's is really renowned. Essentially, every other week on a Friday night, they bring a university professor in to teach a 3-hour lecture on a subject. Maybe it's snakes, maybe it's ferns, whatever it happens to be. And then the next morning you'll meet for 3 hours in the field to go through whatever it was that you just had the lecture on the previous night. And there's around 40 classes that you have to take in order to be certified that way. It's a big deal.
Yeah. And also I could see where that would help, especially getting into the research. And then also you're going to medical school, you're very scientific minded. And that background definitely plays into researching and being very analytical and straightforward with evidence and that type of stuff. But how did you get into Bigfoot to begin with?
So, I came from a family. Vinton County in Ohio still only has one stoplight in the county. It's mostly state and national forest. And so my family We had coonhounds and rabbit dogs, and we all hunted ginseng. We were just always in the woods all the time. And people would come from all over, like the first day of deer season, just to drive by to see how many different bucks that we had hanging. It was just a very renowned outdoorsy family. And I can remember that I was probably 6 and I shot my first rabbit. And that was a big deal in my family. After Thanksgiving dinner, all the guys would go out and go rabbit hunting. And, and that was at 6. And I shot my first buck when I was 8 and was raised that way. But on New Year's Day or New Year's Eve, we'd gotten about 4 inches of snow. And New Year's Day was a beautiful sunny day, but it was really cold in the teens. And I had been taking this guy from the Army around with my dogs. We came along this hillside, and on the side of this hillside up above was a cave. And I saw barefooted human footprints, and I had no idea there was even such a thing as Bigfoot. I didn't know what it was. When I saw the tracks, I thought that, it was like a vagrant or a druggie or something. This was in the 70s. So I went up and looked in the cave to see if, there was like a fire in there or whatever it happened to be, but there was nothing like that. So I believe that whatever it was had weathered the storm in that cave and then had left, hearing me come along with my dogs that day. And then later that year, several months later, I was fishing at a remote beaver dam that no one knew about but my family. And my uncle was fishing with me. Both of us were carrying pistols. It's real snaky back there. And I'd been back there literally hundreds and hundreds of times, from running turtle hooks to just fishing or deer hunting or whatever it was that I was doing. And I'd never had any type of experience, but I was standing on the beaver dam, just quietly standing there, and I heard something walking in the brush, and I was looking, and I glanced and saw my uncle, that he was looking too, and I just figured it was a deer. But then the brush started shaking very vigorously, and something started screaming very monkey-like, and it went on for about 20 seconds. And then after that, I always tell everybody, you know what we did? We kept fishing because, we were all raised in the woods. We all had been in the woods constantly by ourselves at night, even as young boys, running our rabbit dogs and coonhounds. Then later that year, Leonard Nimoy had the show In Search Of, and he had an episode called Bigfoot, In Search of Bigfoot. And when I saw that show, it made me suspicious that that was maybe what I had encountered. And before I had left to go to undergraduate, I had found footprints 2 different times. And so my whole life, I had followed the Bigfoot, anything that was in the news, any book that was written, I had followed it very, very closely. You get out and you're in practice. You live in West Virginia, so you're in the woods all the time anyways. It's right around you. But I saw that Jeff Meldrum, which was an anthropologist, which commonly is on a lot of the Bigfoot shows, was speaking up in Ohio. And I thought, I'm just going to, I'd read his book. I want to go up and, listen to him speak. And I went up and, I didn't know anybody. And so I just listened to it. And it's funny, I was coming back and a friend of mine said, well, what'd you think? And I was like, oh, there's some pretty weird people there. And she's like, well, I don't want to be mean, but, Russ, these are Bigfoot people.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, So later that year, I saw the BFRO, which is, the only scientific group at that point doing research, was having an expedition where, you sign this non-disclosure agreement, you pay like $500. They put you in an area where, things have happened in the past and teach you how to go about doing it. I thought, I'm just going to do it. And if they're weird, I'll just leave. And when I went, I met Matt Moneymaker from the TV show, and Matt and I just hit it off. And from that time on, I was doing all the reports for the group in Ohio and West Virginia. That was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reports ago.
Yeah.
And so in the meantime, I've written now a couple different books, and, and I've been lucky enough to do the TV show, and I've spoken all over the place. It's interesting how, you can get consumed and passionate about something, and largely it's shaped my whole life. I mean, even my farm in Ohio, it's in a location based on Bigfoot activity. When I take time off, it's related to that. Like, I know I'm off next Tuesday. I will be in the woods the whole day. I have around 40 game cameras now, so I'm always in the woods after a camera, moving cameras around, messing with things all the time that way.
Yeah. Now with all the experience that you've had and with having the masters in the conservancy, do you have any explanation for what you heard when you were a kid, like the ape-like monkey sounds?
So I think that for sure that it was a Bigfoot that I have encountered. I think that, it was interesting as like a further aside from that story when that gentleman and I were standing there looking at those prints and, and they were literally, they weren't any bigger than a man's prints. And to me, and, of course, not knowing now, I'd be able to look at them and I would love to be able to see them and cast them and everything else now. But they were fresh. It literally just happened. And I remember him and I were standing there and we were deciding whether or not we were going to follow him. And then we heard in the distance, like a scream. So what I believe is that it was a juvenile because it was about the size of a normal adult human footprint. And so, that'd probably be an adolescent, juvenile Bigfoot. And the scream I heard was, once you got to the top of this hill, you were overlooking a park. And it just seemed to me like it was trying to communicate to find out where its family group was.
Yeah. Also growing up with your whole family kind of being, in the woods all the time, did any of the rest of your family ever have any experiences with these creatures?
It's interesting because, like I said, in Ohio, which the southeastern corner of Ohio is in Appalachia, there wasn't really that big a deal with Bigfoot. You just didn't really talk about it that much. And I can remember that there was a pretty popular historical report in 1980 from the BFRO that literally happened just right there where I was hunting at all the time, literally within just a couple miles.
Wow.
And I'd asked my grandfather about it. And he had told me that, he thought that it was probably a bear, but, keep in mind that here we are now in 2022 and there's less than 100 resident bears in Ohio now. But I can remember him and I being in very, very remote sections, and of course, keep in mind in the 70s, we didn't have good flashlights.
Right.
We were using carbide lights, which is, it's kind of like a miner's thing, it had some rocks in it and water leaked down and it created this gas. And that's how you were walking. You would go to the cellar before you went in the woods and you'd stuff as many apples as you could in your pocket for going out there. And so you'd have 4 or 5 apples, and him and I'd be sitting miles back in the woods off trail in the dark, waiting for the dogs to bark. And, the sound that Bigfoot will make many times is called a wood knock. No one's really sure whether it is a mouth pop or a hand clap, or something start striking a tree. And I would ask him, I remember on several occasions him not hearing it. And I'd say, what is that? And he'd say that it was, a car door slammed way down a hollow miles away. And then it comes up the hollow making an odd sound. And that's what he believed. He just didn't know any differently.
Yeah. That's
one of the big things about Bigfoot in general is tons of people have had experiences with Bigfoot and not know it. They don't recognize the behaviors that are associated with it or the sounds associated with it. I mean, heck, prior to finding Bigfoot, the public didn't even really know that there were sounds associated with Bigfoot.
Yeah.
That was further evidenced by the fact that, we're all getting all these reports on the BFRO.net all the time. But boy, as soon as the show started, then you're getting dozens and dozens of reports a week from all these noises.
Yeah. And also with the different structures that people find, the tree structures that people find. And yeah, it's definitely with the TV shows become way more popular in the culture and
yeah.
People looking for this stuff. And, or before they weren't even looking for it, they just see it and be like, whatever. But now they're understanding with the sounds and with the tree structures and this type stuff, they're understanding that, this could be something interesting.
But going along with that, what we were just talking about, like last year my farm's 150 acres and it adjoins a park for 3/4 of a mile. And I was in the woods, a real brushy part with my uncle, and we were looking for a culvert that went across this ditch so I could get in there with my tractor. I mean, it was really thick. Well, I just happened to notice I'm standing there and there's like this nest, and it's like all these trees that are about the size of my wrist or a little smaller are just twisted off and stacked there. And I said, hey, look at this. And he walked over and he's like, what? And I'm like, well, look at this, nest that's laying here. Look at all these trees that are just broken off like that or twisted off like that. And he just said, huh, and then just walked on because, he wasn't interested in Bigfoot. it's hard to tell how many different things in his life he'd run across and never even looked at it. If it was something to do with a turkey or a fox or a deer, well, he would have noticed it right away. But as it was, he just didn't think anything of it. And I think that's the way it is for the majority of the cases, But then on the other hand, we have the people that are looking at the tree structures or the tree manipulation, and it's really gotten out of hand. People think that Bigfoot's leaving, all these markers everywhere in the woods. And, I just don't think that that's probably happening that much. I have a little doubt that it probably happens some because of some of the great apes, have been shown to do some manipulation that way. But I always just say, historically, we don't have Indians talk about all these things with Bigfoot. Pioneers talk about all these things with Bigfoot, but we don't have any historical record of them talking about the tree structures. And if you start looking at, like, let's say the founding fathers, they hunted for a living, or not for a living, but, to live. And so if there was tree structures everywhere, they would have been finding them and following them, so it just doesn't seem reasonable to me. I think that trees just dance when there's storms. Nature does all different kinds of things. So I just call it tree litter.
Yeah.
Is what I call it. And, and I'm standing in my kitchen now, looking out the window up this mountainside, and, I can see all kinds of stuff that people would, if they weren't familiar with the woods and they weren't outdoorsmen, that they would probably believe that something was up there as well.
Yeah, I've grown up, as a country kid outside of Nashville. I live out 20 minutes outside of Nashville, but I'm surrounded by a forest. And, I grew up hunting rabbits and squirrels and things like that. And when I first saw all the stuff about the tree structures, I was like, oh, I've seen that kind of my whole life and never, it's just something natural in nature. And I'm kind of along the same lines of thinking that you are, that, nature does some pretty incredible things, and there doesn't have to be an explanation beyond that.
No, and it's like, when you see, like, on Facebook is full of all this stuff. And so somebody will put something on there and you'll ask them, do you know what kind of tree that is? So do you know what kind of diseases affect that tree?
Right.
At what level it affects them? They don't have any idea. They're not interested in research. Like I've said many times, there's very, very few researchers across North America doing actual Bigfoot researcher, but there's tons of these people that are enthusiasts, that they're very interested in Bigfoot, and they are interested in having an experience. They're just not really interested in the research.
Yeah. How do you approach researching, and what are you looking for in your research?
So how I go about it is, and everybody has to have, I made all these mistakes over the years. And probably the biggest mistake that I made was ambulance chasing. Like, every time I would get a report, I'd be jumping in my car and driving to wherever it happened. And it just doesn't amount to anything when it's like that. The other thing was spreading myself too thin, that I was in the woods. Like now, I'm usually in the woods a couple times during the week and then once during the weekends. And then about every other month, I'll have one whole week where I'm in the woods. Now I'm trying to concentrate on a fewer parks. Now I may get a really good report and be interested and go talk to somebody, but most of the time now instead of having 40 cameras spread out over a 6-hour drive, I may have 18 cameras in one park, concentrating on getting to know the animals that are in that particular area. And then I keep a calendar, and my calendar has all the reports that I know of, all the noises that I know of. Like one of my friends, which is a family doctor that's interested in long duration recording, he works a couple of the parks that I'm interested in. So he's always recording, and he'll send me a message and say, I heard a wood knock, this date, this time, this location. And so I'm adding that all the time to my data. And so that calendar decides where I'm at in the woods based on historically what's happened. And if I don't have something, like, say it's in June and I don't have anything going on, well, then I'll walk wherever I want to walk and look at a different place. But I just keep trying to add those things in there. So that's not saying that I'm necessarily going to have an encounter because I'm going on places historically where they've been, but it seems like a reasonable way to do it.
Yeah.
And last year, like I was in a park because two gentlemen had a sighting the year before. So I was there the same week, 1 year later. It's interesting. And, I know that you're friends with Matt Pruitt. And of course, Matt and I are friends, but Matt and I talk all the time about how your brain will instantly categorize something as recognizable. So anytime I'm in the woods, before I even start in the woods, I have to remind myself, no matter what you hear, don't assume it's anything.
Yeah.
So I went into that one park based on, that there'd been that sighting there. And so Shade, my lab, is with me, and, he's off leash, but he's always like 20 feet in front of me. It's muddy. We've got rain the night before. There's nobody there but me. And I get up on top of this mountain, and about 60 yards from me, maybe not even quite that far, I just glimpsed and I saw a buff-collared hiker backpacker with a backpack on. And I mean, that's just what my brain said. I just whistled like that for Shade. He ran to me. Literally, it wasn't 10 seconds and we were walking again. But as soon as I took a few steps, I realized that what I'd seen was off trail, and it made me suspicious. And I went over there and ran. There's a ridge right there, and I was able to see the whole area, and there was just nothing there. So, I think that I had an encounter, but it was just not the kind that you desire or whatever. It happens to be that way.
Yeah.
So that's how I go about it. And then in terms of my game cameras, I believe that animals can hear the cameras. There's a lot of studies out right now that the cameras are around 30 decibels and kids can hear them. So you're trying to find places to put your cameras to disguise the noise a little bit. Of course, all of us are trying to get a picture of something, but one of the things I'm paying attention to is how the environment and whatever's in the environment is affecting the animals on my game camera. So if I see 25 deer every single day and a camera's in place for over a year, and I'm seeing that all the time, but in October, for 7 days, there was no deer whatsoever on my camera, it makes me suspicious that something else was in the area. So when, I'll mark that on my calendar, and I may walk in there during that time where I may bring other cameras into that area to see if it happens in there. Just recently I had that happen, and I moved to 3 cameras in there, and I had 3 cameras all do the same thing, that they were probably, the cameras were maybe 10 or 15 minute walk from each other. And so then like next week will be the first week of February, and there's a location that I've had an encounter a couple different times, and I'll be going back there just repetitiously, just trying to reproduce it.
Yeah. And with all those game cameras out, have you caught anything on camera that you think could be Bigfoot, Sasquatch?
Yeah. I mean, you get, I'd say dozens of times that you'll just get a glimpse of fur that, there's really not anything that it could be that's out at night like that. It would be like a flying squirrel, but it doesn't really look like a flying squirrel, which we do have in Appalachia. It doesn't look like that type of thing. What I have found in general is that they seem more interested in your cameras the more remote that they are. Like in West Virginia, I probably went 7 or 8 years without ever seeing a person on one of my cameras because it's so easy to be remote here.
Yeah.
That, no one's around. But in Ohio, the most remote places in the state, I have cameras, and about once a year, somebody will show up on my camera. Yeah. And so then there's other things that, like, several different times I've had something hold a stick in front of the camera, and that's happened several different occasions.
That's interesting.
Yeah. It'll be like, it'll stick something in one side, then it'll stick in the other side. I've had a couple of things that, it looks like that it could be a face or whatever it happens to be. Not good enough that you would want the public looking at it.
Yeah.
But, it's intriguing when your friends see it or whatever.
Yeah. And one of the big things in biology right now is the environmental DNA.
Yeah.
And I know they're doing a lot of research with that, especially for animals they think are extinct, where they can take like a water sample and tell what all animals are in there based on the DNA that's in that sample. So have you, I know in the book you've got a chapter on the eDNA. Have you done any research with that and used that at all?
No. So eDNA has been around really less than 20 years, but just in the last couple years has been used a lot. And it's like good for known animals. But like the TV show Expedition Bigfoot, they just did an eDNA panel. And on the show, they had an area that had kind of some type of tree structure, and there was some fur in there. And so they took an eDNA sample, and people who are interested in that, they can Google like Expedition Bigfoot eDNA sample, and UCLA looked at it. It came up as primate, and it came up being in the chimp family. So, there's some other ones coming out now. Just since the books came out, there's people that are measuring air DNA. I mean, that's the next thing that's coming up. We have all these different forms are coming up, but the reality is that if you're a researcher in the field, it's very hard to get DNA tested. Most of the time it's $5,000 for a sample, and probably just in the last 5 years, I couldn't have found anyone in North America that would do a hair sample for DNA looking at one. You just couldn't find somebody.
Yeah.
And there's hairs that, are reproduced that are, have been found that are unidentified, but, still a challenge.
Yeah, and the TV shows, I mean, they've got a budget to where they can do stuff like that. And I really enjoyed the Expedition Bigfoot show. I thought that they come at it from a good standpoint, and it wasn't too, like the TV shows, they have to produce ratings, and so Expedition Bigfoot wasn't as, I guess, blown out of proportion and melodramatic as some of the other monster shows like Mountain Monsters.
Yeah, I understand the Mountain Monsters. The guys are really nice, but they kind of kill me off because they're all from here in West Virginia, and they all do every episode on this one farm outside of Charleston here. So I know a lot of my friends like the guys because, a lot of us are at the same conferences and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, you'd like them unless you live there. Because, when you live here, there's people that think that they're legitimately trying to, find Bigfoot.
Yeah.
So it makes it hard that way, when it's a subject that, the perception is for people to not take it that seriously. And, you're a person that's legitimately interested in research and the scientific method and how you're doing it. It's probably furthering, a stereotype.
Yeah. And we kind of talked about, the tree structures and stuff. What do you think about gifting? I saw that kind of become more prevalent in the past 5 years, that people are reporting, these creatures leaving them gifts and them leaving gifts.
Have you heard the term habituation before?
Yes.
Okay. So like for me, a habituator would be somebody that either knowingly or unknowingly leaves food or something else out for an animal. Like it may be, your grandma leaves food out all the time and something eats it, but she doesn't know what it is. She doesn't really care or pay attention. And it could be a coon, or it could be a Bigfoot, or it could be whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
There's a lot of cases where, like I was working with this one lady that she had a sighting when she was deer hunting. So she, over the course of the next couple of years, would have things show up at her house. And there's a lot of cases that are like that. I believe that that's real. I believe that people do have those experiences. I mean, when I'm in the woods, I'm always leaving stuff in the woods. Like I use OneX app. It's nice because you don't have to worry about getting lost because it's running on GPS app. And then, I can keep track of all my cameras on it. And then not only that, but like if there is a stump or if there's a big, nice rock cave or whatever it happens to be, then, I may leave all these different toys out in it, or I may leave colored rocks or marbles, or peanut butter or Nutella. I mean, all different kinds of things, just trying to get something to react or be interested or curious, like a primate might be, by me leaving something out.
Yeah. And the big question I know that you've probably gotten 1,000 times is, why haven't we got a body or bones or a carcass, or a hunter hasn't shot one? Why?
It's interesting. About, a couple of years ago, I did a lecture on nothing but why don't we have the bones? And so the easiest way to think about it is that in North America, the number that of these type of animals that would exist would be speculation 4,000 to 20,000. And so probably it's toward the lower side of it. So let's just say it's like 5,000. they'd live about as long as apes do, primates, greater primates, which are around 50 years or so.
Yeah.
And usually there's a 5 to 7% attrition inside those age groups. So in North America, you're just going to have literally a couple hundred animals die a year. And so then you start dividing it out by the states. In Tennessee, where you are, there may be 4 dead ones.
Right.
In your whole state, and they're in the most remote places. They're in the Sitico Wilderness area, in Tennessee, where you can literally go for miles and miles and miles walking into Georgia or North Carolina. So the odds are that you're just not going to see them. We don't really find predator bones, coyotes, mountain lions, things like that. We don't find those bones. I mean, I talked to a ecologist for the U.S. Forest Service in Ohio, and he's like, gosh, I mean, Ohio has 500,000 deer, and considering how many deer there are, we don't even find that many deer bones.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not that common for them to be found. I mean, historically, there have been, giants that have been found. I mean, you can see it all through the internet if you Google, like, pictures of giants, and there was some that was in Minnesota and another in Wisconsin, one out in California, and whole towns are standing with these pictures of these giants and things like that. And, you wonder whether or not something like that might have been Bigfoot historically. But the reality is, if we were in the woods, most of us wouldn't pick up a bone unless, we're walking, there's like some type of human looking head bone or something, then we might be interested in it. But, and so there's some reports too that 4 reports that, people have seen them burying the dead or covering the area with large rocks, that type of thing. So, there's some other mammals that do that. Elephants do it. So the reality is, and the primary thing is, that the animal is rare, and people tend to discount, how big of an issue that is.
Yeah, and that's like, I mean, even something as big as a bear, how many people come across the carcass of bears? And we know they,
Never.
we know they die, and we know they exist, but yeah, and even bears getting hit by cars and stuff, I'm on the same page as you. It's like, I could go out here and walk around the woods for days and never find the carcass of anything, because you have scavengers that are going to scatter the bones and, all that. And that's what the forest is supposed to do. It's this ecosystem, and we have scavengers and bugs and stuff for a reason, to break those things down. So we're just not, walking around in dead things all the time.
Yeah, I know when I started really researching and having, the big things that I was concerned with is I wanted to know why we didn't have bones. And once again, when I was able to give a full hour-long talk about it, and when I got done, everybody that I heard from later is like, well, that makes perfect sense to me now, that you said it like that. But the other thing was, I wanted to know why we didn't have game camera pictures. There's some game camera pictures around, and some of them on the internet are pretty good, but the way technology is, unless you know someone, you just don't really know whether or not they're legitimate.
Right.
And there's some videos that a lot of us believe are legitimate, but if you had a video and you said, hey, Matt Pruitt just got this, I'd say that's real. I know Matt, he's honest and smart, a good guy, and it's legitimate. But if it was, somebody I'd never heard of, how do you know?
Yeah. And there are people out there who are purposely faking this stuff. I mean, with, Bigfoot, cryptids, and in all the paranormal world, period, ghosts and everything else. So yeah, you just never know what the person's intentions are, especially with the viral culture that we live in. People are trying to create things to go viral to get their 15 minutes of fame or whatever.
Yeah, I see it commonly here. Like, there's been just recently 2 different coal miners in West Virginia, that are not related to each other and don't live in the same area, that, have tried to hoax stuff. And I'm not sure whether, that they like the attention or, the notoriety, the ability to be able to get on TV or something, or, maybe they think that, I don't really know why it is, but I know that, it's common for us to see it. I mean, the ones that are compelling are like, I took a case here a while back, and it was, the guy told me that, he said, I'm going to tell you who I am. And he was a mayor, and he's like, I'm telling you who I am so that you'll take what I'm telling you seriously, but you can't tell anybody that, I've given you this. And, the same deal with, like one time I had a police chief and, and a sheriff that have given you reports. These people don't want you telling anybody, they have nothing to gain from it for whatever. They just want it to be out there that, they had this sighting or whatever, and you to keep track of it for them.
Right.
And, the public would have no way of even knowing that, they're around there. But, we get tons and tons of these reports, and probably 90% of the reports are misidentifications, not something that someone's necessarily trying to hoax someone. It's just that, maybe they saw a bear, but they thought that it looked like a Bigfoot or whatever it happens to be like that. So it makes it a challenge that way. But we'll have about 5 cases, say in Ohio, West Virginia, through Appalachia a year that are unimpeachable, perfect, impressionable cases where it's a ranger, it's a state trooper, it's somebody that is a trained observer, very knowledgeable of wildlife, that had a clear, very close daytime sighting.
And those tend to be, like you're saying, really credible. And then also I find, even with because my forte is kind of ghost and haunting and stuff, but the people who are more hush-hush about it to me seem a lot more credible because, like you're saying, they don't want any attention for it and they have nothing to gain. And they're very much like, please tell me that it was something else other than what I saw, because it kind of scares them too.
Yeah. Well, it can change your whole life. Imagine that, you like being in the woods and, you're always in the woods and all of a sudden you're out there and you have this encounter and something happens and it scares you and, it affects your life. I remember that there was this psychologist, doctor, he was from Alaska and he had stopped in Oregon and was hiking, and him and his wife had a couple small kids, and they were up on top of this mountain, and so he had to go to the bathroom, and so he had went to go to the bathroom, in the woods or off trail, and he could hear his kids playing, while he was going to the bathroom or whatever, and so when he got to the top of the hill, he looked down to see where he could see his kids, but in between him and his kids was a Bigfoot standing behind a tree looking down at him.
Wow.
And so he talks about, and is very emotional when he talks about it, everything in his whole life changed in an instant. Everything that he believed about the woods and all the time that he had spent in the woods and everything else changed in an instant.
Yeah, and I've heard other stories about, there's a couple of hunters I know there of one who's written a book about his encounter, and that he'll never go back into the woods after being a lifelong hunter because of his experience with a Bigfoot type creature and how it just kind of changed everything that he thought he knew about the woods, being an avid hunter and going out and hunting, all different types of game. And this just kind of, changed it for him completely.
Yeah. It's interesting. Regardless about what people think or don't think, there's people that are seeing something, encountering something, it's just up for everybody to decide what it is that they think that people are seeing.
Yeah. I've talked about on the show about the missing 411 stuff. Do you think that Bigfoot kind of can play into that a bit, and maybe that some of these weird disappearances, because they typically happen where these big clusters of missing people are typically happening in these vast expanses of forest in the Pacific Northwest and even the Appalachian Mountains. Do you think that Bigfoot, could play into that?
So, David Pilates is the guy that wrote the Missing 411 stuff. And of course, David is a Bigfoot author and wrote 2 great Bigfoot books. And I think that was my impression, was that he believed that there was a chance that some of the disappearances might have been Bigfoot related. And he didn't say that, but, when you're watching the show and stuff, some of the guys that are with him on TV shows are Bigfoot researchers, and the public doesn't know that.
Yeah.
So I think that historically, I'm sure there's cases where things like that have happened when it's related to, there's a juvenile around, there's an old one around, there's one that's, sick or something. I'm sure things like that, have happened. I don't think that it happens all the time, because I think that if it happened all the time, then, man would have been hunting these things down a long time ago and they wouldn't exist any longer.
Right. And there's kind of a couple different camps in the Bigfoot world. You have, of course, like we're talking today, and I believe the same as you do, like this is a flesh and blood creature that has just been elusive. We only knew about, silverback gorillas for 50 years now?
That's right.
But there are also other people that think there's two other camps. You got the supernatural people that think it's a supernatural interdimensional creature,
Yeah.
and then you have other people that think it has something to do with aliens.
Yes. So of course we call that woo, and it's ironic because, you know, woo didn't really exist in Bigfoot world that long ago. I mean, there was one researcher in the Pacific Northwest that was interested in some of the unusual cases. He wrote a couple books and is a really bright guy. But largely, most of the cases were almost always flesh and blood. But just in the last 10 years have we really seen this proliferation of the woo aspect of Bigfoot. And I think that personally that the reason why we've seen it so much is we've never had a time where people are so bad about being in the woods. I mean, they're not knowledgeable of the animals. They're not knowledgeable of the creatures. They're afraid of the dark. They're afraid of getting lost. They're afraid of all these things. You know, so when they go in the woods and they don't find something, or it doesn't happen as often, then they want to relate it to something that is paranormal rather than it just being something that, you know, maybe their skills aren't good enough that they're able to find tracks or a place where something like that would be. And, you know, most of the people, I mean, if they're interested in Bigfoot stuff, they may be out there, you know, a few times a year, maybe once a month, and they're going to a campground with some of their buddies, and they are fixing bacon on a flame. You know, that's what Bigfooting is to them.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not really sure why there's such an appeal for the woo aspect of it. I know that Matt Prue and I talked about it, you know, historically, that's part of culture and that, you know, you type to see it, but, you know, I believe that it's just a person's lack of skill set, laziness, and trying to find some explanation and, you know, what it could be otherwise. I was talking to somebody the other day and they were talking about the woo aspect of it or whatever. And then I was asking them, well, you know, what is it that makes woo believable to you? And most of the time it's like the infrasound thing where, you know, people believe that they get zapped or whatever. You know, and some of the large mammals like lions and tigers and elephants produce infrasound, and, you know, and people believe that it makes the prey pause just long enough that, you know, the animal can catch it or whatever. But for me, it doesn't really seem like it necessarily have to be like that. I look at it and think, you know, these people are going out in the woods. They're not in the woods very often. They're all fired up. They're out there with these friends. It's dark. They're not used to being out in the woods at night. They're not sleeping that well. And so what they experience is like normal anxiety. The symptoms that they have are a normal physiological response that anybody would have. But for whatever reason, they would rather attach supernatural, paranormal type response to that. But I'm just not sure why it is that people would rather have it be that way. But, you know, it is that way.
Yeah, I found it curious, especially when the alien people kind of picked up Bigfoot and dogmen and some of the other creatures out there, whether it be cryptid or something real. They've kind of taken that in the past few years. I'm like, but you didn't have your hands full enough with like UFOs and aliens and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, look at Dogman. I mean, I've never personally even taken a Dogman report. You didn't even really hear about them until the last few years.
Yeah.
I've probably been in the woods as much as anyone that I know. I've never had anything happen to me in the woods that I couldn't explain or that I wasn't uncomfortable or, you know, that I was uncomfortable about. If it was dangerous to be in the woods, then I would have ceased to exist many, many, many years ago because of how much I'm always in these places that no one else is.
Yeah, well, for me, even with the dogman, I think that is a real creature, and I think it's just it's either a coy wolf, which is a wolf that breeds with the coyote, which does happen a lot, and so it's just something people aren't used to seeing because they're kind of gangly, you know, looking, or it's a wolf species that we think is died out that hasn't, you know, and there's a small population of them because the dogman stuff really didn't kick off until the Beast of Bray Road stuff got going, and you know, it's become more and more prevalent after that. But I think, I mean, there's evidence that they released up in that area where Bray Road is, they released some wolves, like 40 or 50 of them, because that used to be their habitat. And, you know, people weren't necessarily aware that they released these wolves. And so now they're seeing them, and there's not very many of them, so you don't see them that often.
Right. Well, I mean, I much rather have, the appeal that there is something physical rather than, you know, people trying to attach something else to it.
Yeah, I mean, even like a lot of the cryptozoology people that I've talked to, like I just talked to the Beast of Britain guy, Andy McGrath, and he even thinks that a lot of this stuff is just, creatures that even though it's lumped into cryptozoology, which is kind of, pseudoscience or whatever, a lot of them believe that a lot of this is misidentification for one, and the other half of it is real creatures that are just kind of like we've been talking about with Bigfoot, where there's just not a huge population, but there's enough breeding population to keep them going.
Right. Yeah, I think that seems like a reasonable thing to me. Of course, the issue inside the Bigfoot thing is that, the citizen science that we have doing all the research, we don't have scientists that are from the universities or the government that are doing it. I mean, whenever Bigfoot gets acknowledged, whether it's a hunter shoots one or he gets hit by a coal truck on the road or whatever it happens to be, then we're going to see the scientists come out of their stodgy offices and then start doing research, and they'll be in places that we're not allowed to go, watersheds that are closed off.
Yeah.
And they'll be, have the very best and the newest of toys. But I think when it happens and it's acknowledged, you'll be surprised how much evidence comes out at once, that how many people across the country have pictures and video that they're holding back, that they're nervous. They don't want anybody to think they're weird, and they're just holding it back.
Yeah. I think it's definitely going to take something like that. And one of the organizations, I forget where they're at, but their intention is to go out and shoot one for that purpose. And whether you agree with that or not, but that's their intention, is to bring a carcass that they shoot out in the open so that people are like,
There's a couple groups like that. North American Wood Ape Conservancy in their area X. There's one, the Gulf Coast people, down in Texas, and the guys at the Olympic Project. I'm not sure that they're actually trying to kill one, but they're like me. We're all carrying a weapon in the woods, because you just don't know what's going to happen.
Well, if you listen to too much of the Missing 401 stuff, you always carry a gun and a personal locator beacon. Yeah,
it's funny. I remember years ago when David first came out with those books, one of my buddies had asked me if I was. He's like, "Are you carrying the woods?" And at that point, I never was, because I've just been in the woods my whole life, and if you're a big guy and you got a stick, you feel like you're okay.
Right.
But as time has went on, and some of the places I'm at, when I come out, there's people that are growing pot inside the state national forest, and, meth people. There's some sketchy people not living, but, that show up in these places. So now I carry all the time. Part of it was, I can remember just a couple years ago, I was coming down this mountainside where an old coal mine used to be, and I was just kind of sliding down this hillside, and there was no phone service, and I thought it'd be easy to break something. And so I started deciding what it was that I needed to spend the night in the woods and feel comfortable with it. And for me, I wanted to have a headlamp, and I wanted to have a gun, and if I just had those two things, I'd feel pretty comfortable. And so each time I'm in the woods, I always have at least those things like that on me.
Yeah, I mean, even if you come across a big cat or a bear, you're the off chance that you would come across one of those, you'd want to definitely have a gun on you, to protect yourself.
Absolutely. Maybe I didn't look at that as much as I should have, in the past or whatever. But now I think about it, often. Of course, it helps, like I have my dog with me all the time. And so a lot of times, he'll notice things before I do.
Yeah.
And I remember, I was thinking about getting a dog, and I was always alone in the woods. And Bobo from the TV show Finding Bigfoot, I was telling him I was thinking about it. And he said, "Oh, you should get one, man." His dog that just passed away was named Monkey, and he said the only sightings he'd ever had Bigfoot was he saw a monkey turn and look at something, and he turned and he got a glimpse of something. So, when I'm with my dog, I'm just glancing at him all the time to see where he's looking or see if he's acting a certain way.
Yeah. Well, I've had a good time talking to you today. Really good conversation. I really enjoyed it. Do you have a way that people can contact you if they have any stories they want to report or get in touch with you?
Yeah, I have a website called thebigfootdoc.com. And if they just go to thebigfootdoc.com, there's links to be able to get my books. There is a link to be able to file a report, any type of thing that they want to send a message to me, or a report they want to tell me about. just go on to bigfootdoc.com.
And your books are available on Amazon Kindle and also beyondthefraypublishing.com, your publisher.
Yes. And people seem to enjoy it, and I appreciate everybody reading it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for coming on and chatting with us today.
Hey, it's good talking to you, my friend.
All right, everybody. Have a great day. Stay safe out there. We'll see you next time. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, head over to the Unseen Paranormal Lounge on Facebook for all the latest updates and discussions about the show. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, or at unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And please rate, review, share, and subscribe to help more people discover the show. The Unseen Paranormal Podcast is proud to be the ambassador for paranormal for Verbal.com. A big thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. You can find more of his music on Apple, Amazon, or Spotify. And as always, thank you for listening.
You have come to the end of the line. Whoa. I can feel you as you pass the other side.